Poppies in October. Even the sun clouds this morning cannot manage such skirts, nor the woman in the ambulance whose red heart blooms through her coat so astoundingly, a gift, a love gift, utterly unasked for, by a sky palely and flamily igniting its carbon monoxides, by eyes dulled to a halt under bowlers. Oh, my God, what am I, that these late mouths should cry open in a forest of frost, in a dawn of cornflowers.
So this is the poem Poppies in October. It was written on Plath's final birthday, the 27th of October 1962, before she died in February 1963. The title itself is both ironic, as poppies do not usually bloom in October. If they did, they would probably die. It's also a reference to one of her other poems, Poppies in July. July in the summer, this would be October would be in the winter in the UK and America where she was living. And so there might be some contrast there between the joy of summer and the coldness of winter. This poem is unusual to Plath's other work as she does not really reference her life, and so it's less explicitly confessional in comparison to her other poems. So we'll talk a bit about the symbolism of poppies now. When we think of poppies, we most often associate them with Anzac Day or Remembrance Day, and particularly their use in the graves following World War I and World War II. You might buy one to wear on your lapel to sort of memorialize this. So they have a real connection with war and with death. In addition, historically, poppies were actually used to make a drug known as opium, which is very similar to heroin. It makes you very, very sleepy. And because of this, they've long since been associated with the idea of slumber or sleep. If you remember, in The Wizard of Oz, there's actually a scene where the Wicked Witch puts Dorothy to sleep in a field of poppies. This is like a long established connection and piece of symbolism. In addition, in ancient Greece, they were used as an offering for the dead. So it'd be important to make a note in your annotations that poppies are long associated with the idea of war, death, slumber, sleep. And that's important to note as we go into the poem. So in this stanza, we open with a really gentle idea. Even the sun cloud this morning cannot manage such skirts. Now the skirts that she's referring to, this is also the same in her other poem, Poppies in July, is actually the petals of the poppy. So if we think about a poppy and its petals, they almost look like skirts. They have that shape. Although it is interesting to note that obviously in a poppy, those petals would face up towards the sky, whereas a woman wearing a skirt, the skirt would face downwards. And so it's almost immediately this idea that maybe things are upside down. There's also quite a good connection to women here as the typical wearer of skirts. And many people pick up some feminist or at least female focused ideas here. But essentially the first line is saying that even the beautiful sun clouds in the sky cannot handle the beauty of the skirts of the petals. They can't manage them, they can't deal with them. And it cuts to the second line, which is actually quite dramatic because we have this idea of an ambulance, but it says, nor the woman in the ambulance. Even she can't handle the poppies. And again, maybe a symbol of death, but also that beauty. So we're setting up a real contrast between life and nature, beauty, and then also death and slumber. We can see then that if we go into the third line, so the woman in the ambulance whose red heart blooms through her coat so astoundingly. Now, when I first read this line, I imagined that her heart was bleeding and bleeding through her coat. But actually the word that is used is blooms, which has almost positive connotations. It's an idea of flowers blooming during springtime, new start. Yet I think there is still something slightly sinister about this line. The ambulance is quite shocking that we've gone from this gentle sun clouds, flowers, to a woman in an ambulance. I think the red heart as well is quite graphic. And we've got this really long hyphen as well, indicating we should have a really long pause here, something very dramatic. So I think there's something slightly sinister about this line. And if you go into the second stanza, we also have this duality between potential positive imagery and ideas and that negative sinister connotation. So in our second stanza, we've got a gift, a love gift, utterly unasked for by a sky. And so a love gift is a really interesting term. Some people have interpreted this to mean potentially a baby. So she's actually in the ambulance because she's pregnant and she's having a baby. And I think that connects to this idea of blooming, of new growth, and the potential of nature being something so optimistic. Also, maybe her red heart is blooming, it is growing at the prospect of having this baby. You could also interpret it as possibly being some sort of a wound. And I think the love gift could be almost sarcastic. If we think about in Cut, that oh, what a thrill, that perhaps like this love gift was given to her to the narrator by a partner or in a marital or domestic abuse situation. So a love gift could actually be a wound, especially if you look at the next line, which was utterly unasked for. And the word utterly, I think we would often like moan. I don't know if we would ever use that in a really positive connotation. Of course, if it is something positive, we also have this idea that the narrator doesn't want positivity. She doesn't want gifts or love. She is instead more focused on death and her own despair. So the gift was utterly unasked for by a sky palely and flamily igniting its carbon monoxide. So we have to wonder, is the sky giving her this gift? Does the sky in this sort of represent hostility? I'm not quite sure. I'd be interested to hear what we think as a class. But then when it is like this idea of palely and flamily, like palely is such a low modal word. It's suggesting something is much less intense. It's sort of soft and understated, but then you're directly contrasted that with it's also flamily. So we have a bit of an oxymoron where how can something be both pale and inflamed? So it's another example of contrast featured within the poem. And what the sky is doing is igniting its carbon monoxide. Igniting is such a high modality verb. And carbon monoxide is, I mean, I don't know if it's a chemical, we'll have to ask the chemistry students, but it is something in the air that can kill you. It causes destruction, it represents pollution. So we could have a little bit of a environmental theme here with the carbon monoxide produced by factories and cars potentially being damaging to the environment, but also to people. So carbon monoxide is actually the cause of Sylvia Plath's death, which would come just a few short months after this poem was written. So carbon monoxide is another motif that sort of connects with that idea of slumber and eventual death. I really like the connection between these two words that start the lines as well, igniting and dulled. I think there's just another really strong contrast there. When you ignite something, it's really quick, like a flash, it goes up in flames. You ignite a fire, you ignite an argument, but then we have it's also dulled. So I'm wondering if maybe in her life, she was only really ignited by the idea of dulling that life and dulling the senses. So I'm wondering if she is escalating to that point. We also have this idea here that the eyes are dulled to what is that line? The eyes are dulled to a halt, to a stop, under bowlers. I think I've got to a halt under bowlers. So a bowler hat, if we think of this guy from Meet the Robinsons, bowler hat though here might represent more men, obviously, in comparison to the skirts. They are a form of workwear. And I think also if we look at this painting, it's by an Australian painter known as John Brack in 1955. It's called Collins Street, 5 p.m. And we can see these men wearing hats and they're very much uniform. The color is not very intense. If you look behind the men in hats, it's just like this stream of monotony. And so I think when we think of bowler hats, certainly like this painting was painted around the time that she was writing the poem, they were a real symbol of the working man, of career men, of modernity. So we could interpret this as the men are blinded to the beauty of poppies. Because of work or career, we sort of lose sense of ourselves and of the beauty in life. And so I think here Plath is being quite critical of the bowler hats and what they do to us symbolically. We have another cry here. Oh my God, what am I? And it reminds me of that bit in Cut. Oh my homunculus, I am ill to kill. So you've got almost a break in the poem. Perhaps this is another turning point. I think it would be really interesting for us to compare the two uses of oh my. So here she's almost like losing balance and she's wondering if she can live in a world of despair. She's almost entering into an identity crisis. She's wondering, what am I? But notice there's no question mark. So maybe it's a statement, in fact, what am I? What have I become? But she's not really curious. She's just sort of acknowledging that this has happened to her. What am I that these late mouths should cry open? Relate and cry. We've got some words with real negative connotations. And she's wondering like why she might be crying or why the poppies are crying if we think of them as mouths that are blooming open. And in the final line, we have almost our final contrast. So in a forest of frost, there's some really beautiful alliteration here, forest, frost, also a bit of assonance of rhyme. But when we think and picture a forest of frost, it's barren, it's deserted, it's cold, but also potentially serene and peaceful. And then we have a dawn of cornflowers. So maybe the forest of frost might represent her feelings now, that coldness, that like loss of warmth in nature. But the dawn of cornflowers, dawn is a word and a symbol that's traditionally associated with hope and new life and new day. So maybe there's a potential of hope here. I think if we look at cornflowers and compare them to poppies, they're quite different. I would say they're almost like quite opposite. A cornflower is very dainty, it's a light blue, whereas poppies are a hardier flower. They're stronger, they're bright red. Red is a color that we associate with death and blood, whereas the light blue is quite positive. Potentially, and this is really just, I guess, a possible interpretation that maybe while the narrator is stuck in this forest of frost, there's this new generation of women or people who are cornflowers and they are dawning. And who is Plath, or sorry, the narrator? Remember, we always say the narrator, but who is the narrator in comparison to these beautiful, delicate cornflowers? So, a possible interpretation there is perhaps referencing Ted Hughes's Fidelity, or like the affairs and mistresses that he had, or even just herself looking at women or people who are happy and light, and she sees herself as this like bloody poppy. Poppies are red. Sylvia Plath for a time had red hair and quite like famously would discuss it. There's a line, I think it's even on the cover of your books, but it's from the poem Ariel, which she wrote on the same day as Poppies in October. And it says, I don't have it in front of me, but like, I rise with my red hair to eat men like air. So red is a really important, powerful color for Plath. And I think that the contrast between the red of the poppy and the blue of the cornflower is something to be noted. So one of the main sort of themes that come through in this poem is the contrast between life and death. And in addition, those contradictory feelings between joy and pain. So we have, for instance, like the ambulance image is so shocking in comparison to the poppies of the first sentence of nature. But then remember, there's that like possible two interpretations. Like, is it pregnant? Is it something joyous and exciting, a new life? Or has this person in the woman in the ambulance been wounded or hurt? Is her heart blooming with love, or is it bleeding with pain? And I think then again, the love gift as well, is it a baby? Is it hope? Or is it a representation of abuse? We also have in that third stanza, sorry, the final stanza, late mouths should cry. So we've got these images of sadness, of despair. Perhaps she is saddened by her career, crying, but then also in the very next line, that dawn of cornflowers. And we've got that contrast between frost and ice. Again, October would be winter in the Northern Hemisphere, whereas cornflowers would bloom in the spring. More you're looking at your July. And finally, like we have this contrast between the beauty of poppies. They're so beautiful that even the sun clouds can't handle them. They don't know what to do. But then they're also something that has historically been so connected with death. And so I'm wondering whether this poem is discussing like her longing for death, for slumber, and it almost seems like a beautiful, viable option. And that kind of idea brings me to the last slide, which is just like there is that motif of a longing for death, and it appears through, the ambulance as a symbol of death, or at least chaos, poppies historically, and then also the carbon monoxide, which, as we know, is how she died. So I'd like you to have a think of what the poem means to you, do some writing. If you have any questions, if you have any interpretations, I didn't really go into every line, and I think it would be really valuable for us to do that as a class.